Okay, I think we're ready.
Yes. So, welcome everybody to this afternoon's New South Wales Policy Community of Practice webinar. Normally, Dr. Louisa Mamouney is introducing someone else, but today she's going to be presenting to us on brilliant briefing notes. Can I just please remind everyone to keep your cameras and your microphones muted during the presentation? But first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that from wherever we are meeting today, you're on Aboriginal land, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today. And today I'm joining you from Ngunnawal land in Queanbeyan. So yes, I'd like to introduce Dr. Louisa Mamouney. She's well known to most of you, but to new members to our community of practice, we're now well over 3,200 members, which is an amazing achievement and a great testament to the great webinars that we've been presenting over the years. So Louisa is the Deputy Chair of the New South Wales Government's Community of Policy Professionals, and since 2020 has been taking a leading role in developing the policy skills across New South Wales Government. Louisa has extensive experience in public policy and programs, including natural resource management, environmental policy, and economic and regional development. Louisa currently works in the New South Wales Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, and has formerly worked in the Department of Premier and Cabinet, Department of Industry, Department of Regional New South Wales, and Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Louisa also has a PhD in public policy from ANU's Fenner School and degrees in science and law. So thank you so much, Louisa, for presenting on brilliant briefing notes today, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra, and I'll also acknowledge that we're on the lands of Aboriginal people today. I'm on Gadigal land. Sandra, thank you very much for the shout out to new members, and it's very exciting. This one is really targeted at people interested in learning about briefing notes, so I expect we might have lots of new interest in our webinar program. We'll drop in the chat the link to join our Policy Committee of Practice if you've been sent this notification about the webinars from a colleague. So briefing notes. I'll just share my presentation and we will, I'll go through it and then there'll be time for questions, and I'm also curious to hear about other people's experiences with briefing notes and sharing their knowledge as well. So we'll do that at the end. I keep referring to this this presentation as my very exciting presentation on briefing notes. I don't know whether I'm alone. I hope I'm not alone in thinking that I find briefing notes one of the most satisfying pieces of work that we do as a policy officer. I really enjoy the practice of preparing a briefing note and honing it to be the best possible piece of work I can do. It's the most creative I find sometimes in my role, is thinking about how I can liven my briefing notes up so that they really get the attention that they deserve. So I hope to share my enthusiasm for briefing notes, even if it's you find it a bit odd. What I wanted to talk about today is why write a briefing note, how to write a briefing note, and using the briefing note templates, and also some other tips. So we'll get right into it. The first thing is, if you've decided to write a briefing note or you're expected to write a briefing note, what is this kind of particular instrument that we use in policy? It's one of the most common things we're asked to do. It's not dissimilar, I guess, to other forms of briefing. If you've ever been involved in a cabinet submission, for example, a cabinet submission is a particular type of briefing note, but it's really the briefing notes are really to seek approval generally, and it's a really good way to get in the ear of the decision maker, and to put before them a proposition and seek their approval. Now that approval might be to do with a regulatory function or a legislative function, or it might be to do with a program. It might be a new piece of policy work that you're seeking to explore, and there can be all sorts of other types of approval. So approval to expend money, approval to initiate a program or implement a program. We also write briefing notes to provide information. Often these can be one of the first things that we get our training wheels on in as a policy professional, is write a briefing note on, you know, an event that's happened, for example, an inquiry. As a junior policy officer, you could be asked to provide a for information briefing note to your executive director about a recent public inquiry. So that would be an example of a providing information briefing note. They're also used to, this is one of the things that I use them for at the moment, is I might write to my minister to say, hey, minister, we've got a problem with this issue and really want you to be aware of it, but this is what we're doing to respond to it. So that's a really significant part of preparing a briefing note, is the framing of the issue and the focusing of attention that you are honing through that piece of that briefing note to elevate an issue before your secretary or before your minister. You can also use it to secure an authorising environment. You know, we're not sure, Minister, if we're allowed to do this. Will you give us approval to do this piece of work? You're acknowledging that you have the capability to do something. Can we explore this path? Can we take this course of action? It's can be quite exploratory. You can also use a briefing note to deal with a risk. So, for example, having a bit of noise on the chat. Thanks. We've got an issue coming up. You know, there's a new type of industry, for example, that, you know, is creating new issues. So let's take AI as an example. Perhaps, Minister, you might want to think about the opportunities in AI, but there are also risks associated with it, and this is how we're dealing with it. A very common form of briefing note is associated with responding to correspondence. Coro, as you might have heard it referred to in probably quite outdated language. You might be asked to do a briefing note because a stakeholder has written to your secretary or to your minister, and you've been asked to prepare a response. Not only do you have to draft the letter, but you also have to draft a briefing note that sits on top to say, these are the issues and we've explored them, and this is the way that we recommend you respond to it. And lastly, I think preparing for a meeting, sometimes we call these meeting briefs. If there is a senior member of your organisation going to a meeting, they might not know all of the detail of your work area. So preparing a meeting brief is a good way of getting them across the issues that might come up during the meeting. Writing your briefing note. So let's step through what's involved here. First of all, you have to scope your briefing note. What is it you're trying to achieve, and who is the relevant person to approve this briefing note and to make these decisions that you're asking them to make. That will depend on things such as delegations and practice within your organisation. What has come before is always a good way to check. I want to get this decision made, but who is the appropriate person to make the decision? Sometimes that's really obvious because if, for example, it was financial expenditure, you would look at the appropriate delegations and you would go, okay, the Deputy Secretary has the ability to spend this amount of money, therefore the briefing note needs to go to the Deputy Secretary. In policy, it's not always that clear because we don't have, a set of delegations that talk about different levels of responsibility for taking policy decisions. But discussing with your manager and potentially also sounding out people above you can help work out if you are targeting the right audience for your briefing note. If it's something that's set in legislation, it's activating a responsibility that is set by the minister, then again, check the delegations because there may well be a delegated responsibility. The minister may have issued delegations to use that legislative power. But once you've identified and considered your audience, who will be the decision maker on your briefing note, also think about the people who it's going to go through on the way to get to that person. You might want to think about things like how much time do they have? Do they know the issue already? What are some of the questions that are going to come up along the way? I'll talk about this further, but generally we want to make the briefing note really easy to read, really easy to engage with. The way I think about it in my mind is it needs to hit you in the face with how, what the problem is and what you're asking them, the decision maker, to do. So things that you can think about are content-rich headings that guide, make it easy to read at a glance. Making sure it's well structured, that the sentences are short and simple. You're not confusing your information with packing in a lot of information. But on the other hand, you've got the right information. You haven't left anything out. Think about tone and eliminate clutter. I got some of these tips actually from a course that I think is still around, offered by the Plain English Foundation, and I have to put this right next to my face so you can see it. You can see my copy is so old, it refers to the Department of Finance and Services, but it's the Getting to the Point Ministerial and Policy Writing Baseline course. I think Plain English Foundation offer similar courses now. And they're really a great way to learn the craft of policy writing for a ministerial and executive audience. So recommend if you're looking for more assistance on writing crisply, cleanly, in plain English, making it really easy to read and engage with, then that's something to follow up with. Templates. I am lucky enough to have lots of contacts in other agencies, and in the last 24 hours, whenever I spoke to someone, I said, would you happen to send me your template for a briefing note? And so I've now looked at 5 altogether. I didn't include treasuries because it was quite different. However, there are some very common elements of briefing notes across all of the New South Wales public sector. If you are around at this time, I want to give credit to my former colleague, Michelle Wood, who worked in Department of Premier and Cabinet at the time, who worked with probably a group of people across government to develop a standard briefing note template. So I think this was around the time, it was probably about 2012, so we're going back a bit. But I can see all of the templates have evolved since then that I've had a look at, but they do contain the same key elements that Michelle developed at the time. So I'll go through those now, and thank you very much for those who assisted in providing a copy of your templates. First of all, they have a title. And usually it's one line. it just, you know, it's to give an indication of what is this briefing note about. The shorter the better. It won't explain too much, but it will give it will be a memory. It will jog people's memory when you say, I sent you a briefing note about this. So the next piece of information generally is the purpose. Interestingly, DCS has a much prettier looking template, I would have to say, for their secretary. The purpose is lower down on the first page still, but the purpose is why you have written the briefing note. So it might be to get approval for this course of action, for example. The next common section is analysis. It's making meaning for the decision maker. It's a bit like being shown a photo of something, but until someone helps you understand what is in the photo, then you won't necessarily know what to think. So particularly when decision makers are very busy, there's a lot on their plate, it's a good way of putting up front, you should make this decision because, and it will have this impact. It's not meant to be a summary of the briefing note, but you should also pay attention to what your local practices are as well in filling out these sections. You'll also notice in each of the templates when you look at, for example, analysis, they often give a lot of tips in how to fill them out as well. So it's a good way of knowing what's expected within your area. Recommendations, they are the key things that you are asking the decision maker to do, and it gives you that authorising environment later. So recommendations are super important. Write them succinctly, but be very clear and very precise. There will be local practices for how you do, how you craft those recommendations, and generally similar to a cabinet submission, the expectation will be the recommendation is to approve something to occur. If you're reliant on noting recommendations, just make sure you really need those. So you often don't need noting recommendations as well, unless there is a very specific need for the decision maker to note something. Approval. So there's always an approval box because, you know, that's going on the public record for the decision maker to approve something. So it will have a box where they can say, yes, this is approved. Sometimes there's more detail they'll get to tick. And this DCS one is also really interesting because they can get even more kind of nuanced in the way that they're responding to the individual recommendations. And many briefing note templates have a requirement for you to identify a deadline. So this is written in slightly different ways, but in the DQ template, it's action by. In the transport briefing note, it's approval date, but make sure you allow enough time for it to get through the process and be approved in setting that date. But also be really clear if there is a statutory deadline or some other consequence of not having this approved by a certain date, that you're clear in your briefing note on why that is. The bit that I really like working on the most is the key reasons. And I'll talk about the background in a minute, but the key reasons really are the meat in your work in the briefing note, and they're really the explanation about why you're recommending what you are recommending. So I often spend a fair bit of time on the key reasons, but I also spend a bit of time on the background. I tend to move things around all the time between background and key issues. how am I defining what the problem is right now depends on the context that I've set out in my background. So I don't know whether you've done a job interview recently, but I always fall in the trap of spending too much time on the explanation and not enough on the this is what I've done. So just be aware that that's generally, people, humans love to tell a story, but for a briefing note, it's just the essential context, just enough to explain the circumstances that are really critical to the decision maker in understanding why there is an issue or why there is a response or a decision required. On the key issues themselves, the headings are really critical. That allows the decision maker to flip to the second page and go, oh yes, I can see all the fantastic analysis that that you have put in there, and that you really understand the issue and you've thought about why it is that you're recommending your decision maker makes that takes that action. So use the headings to help the reader quickly scan and understand the issue without reading too much into the detail. And then they will always come back and read the detail as well. The key issues really help the decision maker feel confident in the decision that they're making. So ensure that that is logical and it flows well, and it's really helping that decision maker feel like they understand the issue and that they're with you in your thinking about the topic. There's also some good tips in this DeFi template. Put your key issues in the order of what is most important. It was a good one, I thought. Generally it should contain analysis, conclusions, reasons, evidence, and explanation, rather than the background, context, process, and history. The other thing that I sometimes do when I'm struggling is I write my key issues first, and then I write the first page. I find that getting the key issues settles me down a bit and I kind of get some ideas out on the page. And I sometimes use the headings that I've done as content-rich headings to write the analysis section, at least give me a first draft. So that's some of the tips that I would like to pass on. Now we're on to probably the third page. This is where the supporting analysis comes in. Often these sections are optional, so if they're not relevant to you, delete the section altogether unless there is a local instruction to keep them in and put not applicable. But generally you'll take these out because otherwise your briefing note will end up being super long and doesn't do the job of putting the most important information in front of your decision maker. So in the DQ template, we have headings about cabinet recommendations or legislative consequences. If they are not relevant for your decision, then just delete those. The ones that tend to be most important are consultation and financial impact. On consultation, you should outline who you have consulted with and what they said and how you've responded. It's quite a challenge to sometimes get all of that in a really succinct way. If you haven't directly consulted with a stakeholder, you can use it an anticipatory, we haven't consulted with this stakeholder. However, from related work, we understand that they would think this, and this is how we have incorporated the stakeholder views in this in our recommendations. Don't forget that there will be internal stakeholders as well, and you'll have to make a choice in crafting your briefing note about how much you cover in terms of internal stakeholders. But think about it from the perspective of who is going to make the final decision and who they will want to confirm that you've consulted with. So if it's a briefing note for a minister, they're more likely to be concerned that we have consulted colleagues in other departments that might impact on their relationships with their cabinet colleagues or key stakeholders or industry groups. Whereas internally, if you're doing a briefing note for your secretary, it might be more relevant for you to discuss consultation with your colleagues within that organisation and the impacts on their program areas. Financial impact, particularly for policy work, we don't often have a briefing note that creates a financial impact. So most commonly, this won't be relevant. However, if your decision is relating to expenditure of budget, which is within your existing budgets for your teams, it's fine to simply note that it has no additional budget impact because it's within existing resources, rather than, for example, specifying that that you'll use this amount of budget from your existing team, unless it's something that's new and novel outside of what you are expected to do already. Next steps, some areas, some templates have next steps. It's in my in DQ's template, but I noticed it wasn't in many of the other templates. So it's a good way of just indicating to your decision maker what you will do as a result of them approving your recommendations. So the next steps could be we will implement this recommendation, or we will communicate this recommendation in a certain way. And contact and approval, many of the briefing notes have a section in there. So if you need to get approval from, for example, from your finance team, or it needs to go through a related policy area, you can include them in the approval pathway if you really want to kind of have that additional certainty that their executive have read it too. I have seen very long sections with many, many approvals. I generally would recommend that you don't do that because it will take forever for your briefing note to get through. I would just keep it with the key people, definitely your reporting line, obviously, but you can include other areas if you want to make sure that it's clear that they've signed off on it. Attachments, normally there'll be a section at the end saying, here's a list of your attachments. Use attachments only to support your decisions and your briefing note. Including additional things just makes it a bit hard for the decision maker to come to grips with what you're recommending. And, if there's many attachments, it can be a bit confusing. You'll have essential attachments. For example, if you've there's a letter to sign or something like that, or a key analysis document that would be better to put in an attachment rather than embed in the briefing note, then by all means that would be excellent use of attachments. Sometimes diagrams don't fit well within the briefing note template, so something that might aid understanding of the audience could be a flow chart, for example. But yeah, just include them in the minimum attachments to make the decision. There's a few other things in here. Some briefing notes, Transport One has options, which is quite nice. The original Department of Premier and Cabinet briefing note back in the day had a risk and mitigation section. So you'll see that there's definitely common themes across all these templates, but also there'll be some local differences. Now, just a few other tips for you. My approach on briefing notes is to try and bash them out as quickly as possible, and then preferably sleep on it and read it again the next day or in a few days' time. I always find I get a lot better at thinking about what should be in that briefing note, having walked away from it a bit and then come back to it. So if you can build in time in your process to do that, it really does ensure that you're very clear in your communication and that you're focusing on the right issues. The refining process itself is quite an art, and it's about, moving sentences around. How can I write this in a more succinct way? How can I get to the point? Have I put the most important information at the front, not buried it in detail? So really make the most of that opportunity to refine your ideas through the editing process. Also, I like to keep my briefing notes. I aim for 2 pages. If they get to 3 pages, I'm okay with that. If they're 4 pages, I'm like, maybe I need to step back and reconsider what I'm saying here. I would say a 4 or 5 page briefing note is only for exceptional circumstances where your decision maker is demanding that level of analysis and detail. I had one recently that was representing 10 to 15 years of work for a particular project. So and a very tricky decision under our legislation. So that definitely benefited from a longer form. But most briefing notes should be in the order of 2 to 3 pages. I also do a check at the end, obviously for typos, and it's a great idea to ask a colleague to read it over. One of my former bosses, her name was Marion Bennett, and she worked in the former cabinet office, and I worked with her quite closely. And one day I noticed her doing something, and she had a ruler, an old-fashioned wooden ruler, and she had a briefing note printed out. This was in the olden days when we printed stuff out. She had a ruler and she was checking each line and each sentence. And she would read out the sentence aloud. She would check that it was factually correct and that there were no typos or errors in it. And I just, myself, even though I don't print things out like that anymore, sometimes when I really want to make sure I have perfected my briefing note, I will read sentence by sentence to check that it is both factually correct and does what it needs to do without creating any errors. It's a great idea to ask a colleague as well to do it as well, a little peer review. Can you check for typos? What do you think of this? It's always, and I'm sure that if they've done it for you, you will do it as well. The other just thing to think about is just make sure you don't have any loose ends in your briefing note, and that, questions that you've left unanswered, issues that you've flagged but not responded to. Make sure you either deal with those issues or rethink whether or not that information needs to be there. And generally, don't include information that's in excess of getting the decision maker to respond. Lastly, track your briefing note through approval and implementation. It's not just oh, I've done this and I've got it off my desk situation. Some briefing notes are probably like that, but others, if you care about the outcome, then you will be checking and tracking it through your corporate systems to see who's approved this. Work out if it's taking a long time for them to approve it. Is there a problem? Should you try and get in contact and ask them about it? Is it just not been seen as a priority, or is there some other issue that you are unaware of that needs to be addressed? So, and then finally, when you get your briefing note back, obviously check that everything's been done. If there was a letter that was meant to be sent, check that the letter's been sent, and go ahead and implement the recommendations. I think I can see lots of activity in the chat, which is great. I'll take my screen down and we'll see if there are any questions or perhaps comments, and I'd be really interested if you've got other tips to share as well.
Thanks, Louisa. I think you broke Teams. We hit 1,000 people online, so that's just fantastic. And as always, the recording of this webinar will be sent out after we hit stop at the end, which sometimes we forget to do. So Louisa, look, there's a flurry of questions, but I'll start with one from Rob Lloyd-Jones. And Rob, if you want to put on your camera and your microphone and ask the questions. But I guess, and to sort of add to Rob's question, Louisa, you as a decision maker, on average, can you say how many would you be approving in a week?
I would say on average, potentially a couple a day.
Right. Okay.
There'd be a lot of variability
Yes.
week to week.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
you know, and some briefing notes, you know, they're very significant issues, many policy considerations to draw together, that they will take me a long time to get through and feel confident about. Sometimes I'll seek out the author and ask them questions. If they're really straightforward, and I do love a briefing note that I can just go yes to. So yeah, if they're straightforward, that's the response. And really, I know I've spoken to other colleagues about what their sign of a good briefing note is, and it's where it gets through approved with no changes and everyone is on board with what you have recommended. So I think that's the goal, really.
Yep. Excellent. Rob, does that answer your question, or would you still like to come online and sort of follow up with what Louise has already said?
No, thank you. No, that's a good understanding, good way to frame it when you're writing one, is to think, how can I get this approved as quick as possible? But I was just wondering, I think when you were mentioning attachments as well, is there kind of a time limit that you think, or how long should it take a minister or whoever it is that's approving this briefing, that if you have kind of a time in the back of your mind, whether it's 5 minutes or whatever it is? Yeah, I just wondered if you did have kind of a time it should take someone to read through a briefing note and attachments.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. The attachments really should be just there because they are essential. So don't add attachments just because you think it might be interesting reading. They probably won't get to it. What I find really surprising, as we get more senior and as we see more of decision making occurring within the government, is how quickly our decision makers are able to make decisions on quite limited information. Most of the time, we are over servicing in the provision of information for decisions to be made. Sometimes, and I'll note our last webinar as well on this, we underservice in briefing notes. It is essential, as the briefing note is on the public record, to make sure you have the essential information that, as public servants providing frank and fearless advice, we should be including. So don't leave stuff out because it's awkward. You can always reference that information in a way which is, this is a difficult issue, this has occurred, you need to know this, Minister, to make this decision. So don't be afraid to include that information, even if it takes a bit more time for the decision maker to get across, but just make sure it's really critical to that particular decision that they're making. And if there's another issue, then perhaps it belongs in another briefing note at a later point, rather than trying to pack everything in. Thanks.
Thank you. Look, there's a flood of questions, and we'll try and sort of pick out themes so that we can try and sort of answer ones that are similar. But Emma, Bruce, yeah, and if you can just introduce yourself and let us know where you're from, which department, that also helps. So Emma, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hello. So I'm coming from Building Commission New South Wales as part of Department of Customer Service. And my question was just around, I guess, best process. There's a couple of people that do things a little differently around here. Some prefer to draft it in a Word doc, and then it goes around the world and captures all that feedback and then put into e-approval. So that's sort of a quick process to tick it off. Or do you suggest just putting it straight into e-approvals and being able to capture that feedback and those comments and changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think different agencies have different apps for their management. We use something called CM. I don't even know what it stands for, but
Content Manager.
Content Manager. The disadvantage of in our world, I'm not familiar with your one, but only one person can edit it at a time, and it's a bit unstable. So I have had briefing notes get corrupted or lost. So where there are a lot of people contributing to one briefing note, then yes, putting it in SharePoint or something like that, which allows multiple editors at the same time to be involved, can work. Just be aware of your organisational requirements in terms of putting sensitive material in different formats or in different systems. So follow whatever your local practice is. But yeah, if it's a complex issue with lots of input, then it can be a good way of collaborating.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emma. And look, there's been also some really helpful content added in the chat about using the read aloud editing tool as a way to help sort of sense check what you've written. So that all looks great. Apologies if I mispronounced your name, Macius. You've got several questions. Can I please maybe get you to just limit it to one that you would really like an answer from?
Sure. Thank you. In deciding the parties to be included in the consultation section, when there are too many, let's say more than 10, could you provide your view on what factor to consider to limit? Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that consultation sections I find quite difficult for this reason. The expectation I feel through the template is that, this is just going to be a couple of lines, but often consultation is a big piece of work in itself. So if consultation is very important to this particular decision, then you may want to pull out this consultation analysis into an attachment. And I'm thinking in relation to, for example, a consultation paper, you may have consulted with a range of different external stakeholders, and they perhaps have, made submissions. Then the consultations section would actually be built out by some stakeholder analysis that you're providing in an attachment. For more simple decisions where perhaps an internal, more of an internal decision, then think of who has a stake in the outcome, or who might be offended by the decision that you're making, and particularly, or who the decision maker might feel, I'm not sure if this will be okay with this particular area. So definitely think about it from the perspective of the decision maker and the audience that the briefing note is written for, and then just limit the description of consultation to the people or organisations that they will be most aware of and concerned about, is my suggestion. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Louisa. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. Yeah, look, and some people were asking about a template. So you obviously shared 4 different ones. So it's clear that each department has its own way of doing things. So I don't think there's necessarily a universal one that applies. So yeah, I guess you just need to check with your team to make sure that you're using the correct one.
Yeah, it should be available. Yeah, ask a colleague if you're not sure, if you're new. I know ours is available. When you go into Word, there's a section to access the templates. But if you're not sure, your kind of coordinating area, ministerial services will be able to point you in the right direction.
Yep. And there's also a question about sharing the slides that you presented to us today. So I'm sure we can do that as well. So All right, Alana, you had a great question. Would you like to come online and introduce yourself and ask a question?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Louisa. That was a really great presentation. I'm from DCS and my team don't produce briefing notes often, but I was wondering what your recommendation is on how we can practice briefing notes to upskill and to build our capability when we don't often have to produce them. Yeah, what do you recommend?
Yeah, look, I think it's definitely a great skill to have, and it's a common process across all of government. So definitely, your ability to write a briefing note will be a useful skill as you progress in your career or move around in the New South Wales Public Service. In terms of practicing them, it actually, it's a good point. Sometimes you don't need a briefing note because you're working so closely with the executive who are making a decision that they may not want a formalised briefing note, and you can just get an answer from them directly. But I think in that situation, also be aware that if they are making, if there are decisions to be made in your area that need a public record and an accountability that a decision has been made, it is a really good way of securing that. You can secure it through an email, but a briefing note gives you that formality that elevates that decision. So have a think about that, Alana. If there are decisions that are being made, potentially that are being made on a more informal basis, have a discussion with your manager about, or perhaps this is one that we could do a briefing note for instead of our more informal processes. But the other suggestion I have for practicing is as I mentioned earlier, there might have been an event or an issue, perhaps something that's not even, on the framed as a problem at the moment, but your team considers there as a problem. Have a go at drafting a briefing note about a new issue that everyone just kind of takes for granted, and see how it turns out. And if you think you've got an important contribution to make, you can always take the next step of submitting it. So not all of our work, in fact, I would say a large proportion, maybe not a large, but I would say 20 to 50% potentially of briefing notes don't always get all the way through to decision making in the same way cabinet submissions don't either. There is a lot of thinking about things, trying to put it into the framework of a decision. They don't always work out. So that in itself is part of the practice of developing policy. It's about identifying issues and undertaking critical analysis and proposing recommendations. So yeah, definitely you can, pick a topic that's relevant to your work area and have a go at developing a briefing note just as part of your practice. But also you can ask your executive, are they interested in getting a briefing on, a particular issue or an event or something that they might find interesting and would appreciate the value in order for you to get the skills in that area.
Yeah, thanks, Louisa.
And I guess on a similar theme, Gordon had a question about some real examples that show this excellent use of language and English that you're talking about, Louisa. Gordon, did you want to elaborate on that question?
Hi, Louisa. Thanks very much for the webinar. 1,000 people online. That's pretty good. That's obviously a hot topic. So I was just wanting to get my hands on some really good examples of briefing notes that are concise. It's that whole conciseness that's sometimes kind of an issue. I tend to ramble on, as I'm doing right at this moment, and it comes over in the briefing notes. So like a few worked examples of good ones would be fantastic for maybe different types of notes.
Yeah, I would love to be able to provide you with one, Gordon. I did think about it But unfortunately, I don't want to put anyone's particular work in the spotlight, even if it's for good reason, because I think that they'll get nervous about it, or it might not be appropriate to share the content. My suggestion is that you ask colleagues, do they have briefing notes that they're willing to share with you where they thought that they were good examples? It's probably the best way. Also, if you can ask your executive director or ED, hey, do you have an example of a briefing note that you thought was good that I can learn from? Gordon, I think you're sometimes the rambling nature of our thoughts is beneficial. So, you know, starting somewhere and being able to write about your views is definitely, you know, has to be part of the process. I would suggest, you know, doing it in short, giving yourself a deadline, doing a short piece of work, stepping back and then coming back to it and saying, actually, what are the key bits of information that I need to get across here? And going, no, I can draw a line under that bit. I'm going to move on to the next topic. But yeah, definitely, a lot of people struggle with that issue.
Brilliant, thank you.
Hey, thanks, Louisa. And Shobi has an excellent question. Shobi, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and I think this is something that everyone would like to get some ideas from you, Louisa.
Hi, Louisa. Thank you. Excellent tips. I really appreciate the personal experience you've brought into it and how we can do better. I'd like to know what the common errors are that you have seen, and yeah, what your hopes are as a result of this session.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what not to do? Normally I try and focus on the constructive, positive, but look, I do have some things of common errors. The common errors would be the reverse of what I've said: not identifying the correct decision maker, not including essential information that decision maker needs to make the decision, and thirdly, putting in information that the decision maker doesn't need, and therefore making the briefing note very convoluted and hard to get to the nub of the decision that they have to make and the considerations. We went through quite a process with being able to brief our new ministers recently with the new term of government, and our staff were super keen to be able to present their ideas and their work area to our minister. So we ended up with a lot of briefing notes to the minister that not only asked for, you know, something in particular for her to approve, but added in a whole lot of additional detail. And Minister, you might also like to know about this. Unfortunately, I don't think those briefing notes really made it through because the executive realised that the minister needed the time and space to get across things in her own way, and it wasn't necessarily the best way to present those issues by adding in a whole lot of new issues and putting those in front of her. So they're some of the other tips. Avoiding typos. Typos are really interesting from a perception perspective. Even though you may have put a lot of time and effort into the thinking behind a briefing note, if it contains typos or everyone makes them, like it's really hard, and why it's a good idea to get someone else to read it. But if it goes up the line with typos in it, it draws attention in the wrong way to your briefing note. It makes it look like it, you know, hasn't been through a proper quality assurance check. It looks sloppy. You know, the occasional typo, you know, it's unavoidable, but try and avoid them. So yeah, that's some of the things to not do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Adriana had a question for you, Louisa.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra and Louisa. I work in the Science and Insights division at DQ, and I wanted to ask, what are the kinds of risks and mitigations that you might include in that supporting analysis section? For instance, might you include communication risks, or maybe only, you know, the highest risks if you've, you know, put them in a matrix?
Yeah. The risk section is really, I find quite challenging from that perspective. What do you identify as a risk? I've moved away from a defined risk section generally, even though there is a heading for it, because any really key risks I will be addressing in my key issues and reasons section of my briefing note. And so really, if you want to do a risk analysis, it's really to pick up things that that might be missing already, or that really would benefit, the decision maker will benefit from seeing that you've identified the risk and addressed it. But it's actually quite unusual for a decision maker to need that additional analysis if you've done a good job at the rest of your briefing note. But I know it's in our template and I do struggle a bit with it. If you are going to use it, I would suggest 3 to 5 issues at most, and make sure your mitigation is really clear and direct in addressing that risk that you've identified. Communication risk or reputational risk, I'd steer away from. You've got the communication section and consultation section to cover that. Reputational risk, people love, you know, as public servants, we're quite aware of the reputation of government and how a decision could impact reputation. I think as long as it's clear, the briefing note is clear about the consultation and the stakeholder views, you don't need to call that reputational risk out on its own, because it will be fairly apparent to the decision maker. But yeah, I think financial risks, climate change risks, depending on the situation, you know, business continuity risks, you know, they're all the things. If you haven't covered it somewhere else, then you can capture it in a risk analysis table.
Excellent.
Thank you. Look, we're almost out of time. There's been a few questions on this topic of the use of AI, Louisa, so I might get Tim Owen to ask this question, please. Tim.
Hey everyone, thanks so much. DP High from DeFi. Yes, just that query around rolling out of artificial intelligence, Copilot being a sort of trusted tool for us. How are you using it? How are you seeing it used? What are your thoughts?
Terrifyingly, when we first got Copilot, I did ask it to write briefing notes, and it was startlingly good. Although I don't know whether it was as good, like I felt Chat GPT was better. Anyway, if I get really stuck and it's a boring briefing note and I just need to get something out and I'm disengaged in the subject matter, sometimes I use AI to help me as a thought starter. I will inevitably probably completely rewrite it after my editing process. But sometimes when you've got writer's block, it can be a good way of getting some thoughts down on the page. But you really obviously need to check every single sentence, because AI can pick up things that are not factually true. It can misunderstand what you're getting at. So yes, I would say use it. It can help you get started. It can help you with efficiency, but don't rely on it. I'm sure that's I'd be interested in others' views, but I'm sure that would be a common experience.
Okay, thanks. Look, I apologise to all the other people who've put lots of other great questions in the chat, but the hour is almost out, and so we do need to call a close to this fantastic webinar. So once again, just wanted to thank Louisa for her time today. And as we have said earlier, the recording of the webinar, a copy of the slides will all come out in the email to everyone who's a member of the Community of Practice. So if you've joined today and you're not a member, then please hit the link that I provided earlier in the meeting. So yes, and we've got some other great webinars coming up in the next few months, so stay tuned. But I'll hand over back to you, to Louisa, to close. Thank you. You're on mute, Louisa. Sorry.
I don't think my button works.
It's working now. I can hear you.
Oh, great. Can you hear me still? Oh, obviously, there is a threshold at which Teams breaks with so many people on the line. I wanted to say thank you for joining us, everyone. I didn't expect my presentation on briefing notes to be as popular, but I'm glad that I share an enthusiasm with such a distinguished group of people across the New South Wales government. So thanks very much. Yes, we'll be back in August for another great webinar, I think featuring the Premier's Department and perhaps TCO and some really interesting work that they're doing there. So I'll see you again shortly.
Thanks, Louisa. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.